Thank you, and thank you to the Scientific Committee for inviting me to speak today. So I'm going to be covering the use of real-world evidence in guideline production. Can everyone hear me? Thanks. So first of all, my interests. I'm an infectious disease physician, former chair of a guideline panel. I have Cochrane roles in technology and living evidence approach to updating systematic reviews and guidelines. And I am based at Cochrane Australia at Monash University, and also CEO of Covidence non-profit platform for systematic review development. So my outline, I'm going to be talking about real-world evidence, particularly what is real-world evidence, why are we talking about it now, how is it used, and particularly about the implications for guideline developers. So if you have a sense that the discussion around real-world evidence is growing, you're not wrong. This is a simple search in PubMed of term real-world evidence, and you can see it's a term that 5 or 6 years ago was actually very uncommon, but is now growing very rapidly. But perhaps more importantly, if we look at the proportion of regulatory submissions that include real-world evidence, here data from NICE over a 3-year period, you can see a growth from a little under 10% to now close to 40% of submissions, including some form of real-world evidence. So quite a rapid change in that regulatory environment. So what is real-world evidence? There is really no consensus definition about what real-world evidence encompasses. But to understand real-world evidence, we've first got to understand real-world data. And there is variation in the definitions around real-world data, but it certainly is based upon an understanding that it does not include conventional randomized controlled trials. And the core understanding of real-world data focuses on clinical data, particularly electronic health record and registry data, administrative data such as claims and billing, and patient-generated data from apps, wearables, social media, etc. There is debate about whether observational studies are included in the definition of real-world data, and also about whether pragmatic trials, large simple trials, registry-based trials, etc. are also in the definition. So some variability there. Real-world data then leads to real-world studies, or essentially the studies that use real-world data. And from that is derived real-world evidence, the evidence that is formed when we analyse real-world data collected in those studies. So to give you some examples, really the archetype are pharmacovigilance studies post-registration of a new drug or device, and this example from the US FDA Sentinel Initiative, now close to 100 million individuals included in that data set. And then this analysis looking at both the effectiveness and also importantly the harms of drugs. So in this example, rivaroxaban versus warfarin. And so really the core of real-world evidence is pharmacovigilance post-registration, particularly to detect harms, long-term harms and rare harms. But of course there's also a number of studies that are looking primarily at effectiveness questions. This example from PCORnet, established by PCORI in the US, also around about 100 million individual patient records. And this study looking at an uncommon procedure, so this is gastric surgery to assist with weight reduction in adolescents, and looking at the association between different procedures and percentage change in body mass index. So here a focus on an uncommon procedure. And in this example, again an effectiveness question looking at one of the most important data sets in the UK, CPRD, and here looking at from a total data set of 11 million people, a cohort of people with diabetes, and looking at the association between influenza vaccination and mortality. So of course a very important outcome. And perhaps one of the most extreme examples, the Odyssey collaboration, now including individual patient records for close to 600 million individuals, And then this analysis looking at treatment pathways in people with hypertension. The inner circle showing initial therapy, the middle circle, the second-line agent used, and the outer circle, the third-line agent. So this, I think, just to give you a sense of the sort of data sets that are being brought together and the sort of analyses that are then being run on those data. So why now? Why the rise of real-world evidence? I think there are really three main drivers. So first of all, there are methodological discussions which have been prevalent for some time, but I think now gaining momentum, particularly around the well-known strength of conventional randomized controlled trials in its internal validity, but of course the debate about then the external validity of those studies. And this perhaps exemplified by this quote from Scott Gottlieb, the current FDA commissioner, who talks about the limited and rigidly constructed circumstance, here referring to conventional randomized controlled trials, and in contrast, the far richer, far more diverse and far more informative real-world evidence. So these are the sort of attitudes and opinions that are now becoming quite prevalent. And I think together with an awareness that particularly for rare and long-term harms, real-world evidence has a very important contribution. These, I think, the key methodological discussions around the use of these sorts of data. I think secondly, a very important driver is really the cost of conventional randomized controlled trials. So in this data set, median cost of a phase 3 trial of $21 million. That is certainly an important influence, particularly in the discussions around regulatory decision-making. But I think it's also the ongoing evolution of the ecosystem around real-world evidence. But again, when we think about real-world evidence, we really need to understand the individual components that ultimately contribute to that evidence base. So that includes data. So a lot of work on improving the ability to capture data during routine clinical care, although that remains extremely challenging. The studies, so the development of new types of studies, for example, platform trials or registry-based trials. Analyses, so of course a lot of methodological development, particularly around observational data such as propensity score matching, but also machine learning approaches. And then finally the systems, the collaborations, the partnerships and the policy environment that is really encouraging the development of real-world evidence. So what are the uses of real-world evidence? So again, I think the key driver currently is really the regulatory environment. And I think from the point of view of industry, I think there's very much a sense that real-world evidence has come of age. And of course, a number of regulatory agencies around the world are engaging with the use of real-world evidence in licensing decisions. And particularly, I'd say at the forefront really is the US FDA, issuing guidance around the use of this form of evidence for decision-making around medical devices, and then recently also the use of electronic health record data to capture data in clinical studies. But I think although that has been the focus to date, certainly from the point of view of industry, I think there's now a sense that real-world evidence is now going to expand its influence across other venues of decision-making in healthcare systems, including the development of clinical guidelines and also the decision-making of healthcare professionals and the way they use drugs and devices. So what are the implications for guideline developers? I think the first thing to say is that to date, the use of particularly these newer forms of real-world evidence has been relatively limited to date. This is an analysis of the use of the CPRD dataset in NICE clinical practice guideline development, and certainly until 2015 you can see relatively modest use and mostly focused on incorporating data around incidence, prevalence and risk. And I think this is really typical for guideline development around the world. But that's certainly going to change. And I think when we think about implications for guideline developers, we can think of really three main domains of those implications. So the first is what we could talk about upstream, the source of evidence that we have available when we're making guideline recommendations. So we are going to see more of this type of evidence. It's going to grow quite rapidly. So it does mean that for many of our recommendations, we are going to have a larger data set or a larger set of evidence upon which to draw. But it is going to produce a number of challenges, particularly around the complexity of the appraisal and incorporation of that evidence into our decision making. So to just touch briefly on some of the methodological implications, of course, for questions around health interventions, which are inherently about causal inference, then no matter what the size of the data set, there's no escaping the difficulty of making causal inference from observational data, particularly around the ability of that particular data set or study to capture potential confounders. Should also note that for questions beyond interventions that are non-causal in nature, so particularly around prognosis, risk, diagnosis, of course these data sets are in some ways the most useful and most powerful data sets upon which to draw. But for questions of interventions, the effects of interventions, I think we can be very easily drawn towards the power of the size of the populations that are included in these studies. But I think our focus should be primarily on the covariates that have been captured and the ability of that study or analysis to control for confounding and the analytical approach that was used in that particular study. And so, of course, just to note that this is a very rich and active area of methodological development, including an approach of a sort of target trial developed by Miguel Hernan and others, famously demonstrated in this study around hormone replacement therapy, but an increasing amount of guidance now available to assist in this sort of methodological approach. But of course, it's not just those approaches that we are going to need to deal with. It's also forms of machine learning that are also being applied to these data sets. And so in this very nice paper from Ida Sim a few years ago, we can see that these new forms of analyses do fit within our conventional understanding of how we derive insights from health data, but they are a very different approach. And so we do need to develop an understanding of these methods, what their benefits are, and then importantly, what their limitations are. In appraising these studies, another very active area of development is the development of tools that can assist in the appraisal of these studies, particularly the Robin's Eye tool, which was published fairly recently and is undergoing further development. So that's some summary of some of the upstream implications. But if we look downstream from guideline development, in the context of a sort of evolving new digital ecosystem, we can see that not only can we use these studies in our guideline development, but it's also, I think, a very important opportunity for us to monitor the effects of healthcare interventions on practice and ultimately on patient outcomes, so that we can better understand what the impact of the interventions that we're making guidance around is actually having in our healthcare systems and ultimately in the health of the population for which we are making recommendations. So that's an extremely important opportunity, I think, for guideline developers. And then finally, in what I could describe as the midstream implications or the actual process of developing recommendations, of course, we have the rise of machine learning for that process itself, or the use of artificial intelligence, perhaps exemplified by this quote from the Candle Project within the US Cancer Moonshot program. And of course, there are many, many examples of this where approaches are being taken using individual patient data, not only to understand incidence, prevalence, risk, but also here to determine optimal cancer treatment strategies. So it's inherently about causal inference, and it's inherently about recommendations or decision support to shape healthcare. So, of course, this is extremely controversial, but I think we are going to be seeing more and more of this. So I'm just going to conclude with describing what I see as some of the key challenges in the world of real-world evidence, and then some final conclusions. So key challenges. So firstly, opaque and variable data quality. This is certainly one of the key challenges. So there needs to be improved data capture and quality assurance and standardized data provenance. So we understand the quality and the source of the data that we're using. There's currently very variable data access. Data sits in silos, and there's concerns around privacy and sharing. So we need development of data standards, community engagement in the development of policy frameworks, and then policy exemplars and systems to really drive culture change around that sharing. There's opaque and at times very variable methodological quality, both in the design, the analysis, and the appraisal of these studies. So we need a lot of work on development, promotion, use, and clear reporting of consensus methods. And finally, I think in our world, we have to recognise, to date, limited understanding, trust, and the capacity to appraise and use these types of evidence. So we need all of the above to assist us, but also we need to engage and to build our capacity. So to conclude, real-world evidence, we need to understand its composite parts. We need to understand the data, the studies, the analyses, and the systems that are bringing that into the process of guideline development. It is here to stay. It's going to become more common. It's going to become a much more important part of the way that we develop guidelines. And I think really three main implications for guideline developers. We're going to see more studies and faster studies, which does mean more evidence for us, and it is going to provide, I think, very positive benefits for us, particularly around harms. But these studies are going to be harder to appraise and incorporate. Downstream, I think, again, very important opportunities for us to engage proactively with to better understand practice change and health outcomes. And in the midstream, an increasing role for individual level data and artificial intelligence. Thank you very much.